Please welcome Fabio Carnero.
Yeah, of course.
Hello, everybody. I'm here to talk about design systems, specifically an email design system at enterprise scale. Or alternatively, I'm here to talk about arguing semantics endlessly with coworkers, alienating designers, angering them, considering even leaving my career because of the stress brought on by attempting to fix email at an enterprise level with a design system. I'm Fabio Carnero, as Jason said in his introduction. You can find me on Twitter and several other places online at FLCarnero. So this talk is a little bit different for me. I've been speaking publicly for a long time, but usually about code. And a nice thing about speaking about code is that it's concrete. You write code a certain way, you get a specific result. I can stand up here all day and say, this is how it goes. This talk is very much an in-progress story of what I've spent my past year doing. For the benefit of kind of giving this talk a little bit of a start, let me give you some background of who I am, especially for those who may not know me. As Jason mentioned, I worked for MailChimp for a long time, just about 8 years. I started in 2009 as his 15th employee. And my first 6 years at the company were spent as its sole email developer. Every template in that library I've built, although at this point, let's say 99% of the templates in that library I've built. I think at last count, my total lifetime templates, because I used to count them, I've built over 1,200 emails at this point. So over that time, over that 8-year period, I helped grow the company from one that was sending about 50,000 emails a day on behalf of 35,000 users to sending over 1 billion emails a day for over 16 million users. At this point, MailChimp sends between 1% and 3% of the world's total volume of legitimate email. And then in 2012, I published probably the thing I'm most well known for, which is that hybrid coding method. Eventually, though, I kind of needed a change. 8 years of the company is a long time. And so I left MailChimp back in February of 2017. I took a nice long sabbatical, and then I packed up and moved to Amsterdam, where I joined Booking.com. That was in September of 2017. And I was brought on to fix how the company does email marketing. It's a very tall order. It's a company of more than 17,000 people, making billions of dollars a quarter, and I'm just one person. And looking at it, the problems were very clear. They extend beyond design there, but they're most readily apparent in the design. This is just a selection of some of Booking's emails, and organization-wide, email is heavily fragmented. There are more than 90 emails being sent to just guests, and this is not covering the partner side, so hotels, sent by over 20 teams. All of them rarely collaborate. There's no unified strategy because as a company, Booking is very Dutch, and that means they're very egalitarian. And so teams are empowered to kind of go and do whatever they'd like. A/B testing is also a huge thing for Booking, and in my opinion, it's massively overvalued. Consistency is always in jeopardy because of it, because any team anywhere can test anything in any email or page of the site without having to kind of account to anybody else. As long as they don't lose the company money, they're empowered to kind of work the way they feel is best. Thankfully, Booking is at a stage where they realize they have to change. The team I am a part of and got brought into is kind of spearheading that change. One of the ways we're doing that is via a design system. So just real quick, to kind of set the standard here, what makes a design system? A lot of designers think it's something like this. This is MailChimp's pattern library. You can find all the visual elements used in the application itself, along with the corresponding code. But what's missing here And what makes a design system is comprehensive documentation. A great example of a full and complete design system you can find at Atlassian. In their system, everything is really well documented, from fundamental and foundational elements like the grid to components like buttons and patterns like a page header. That documentation covers principles and the general approach of the system as well as instructions for use of those elements. So, to recap, a design system is a collection of elements that are governed by a set of standards. Documentation is what makes a design system, not the actual elements themselves. In the best systems, not only is the what covered, which is any visual element or any development element, but also the how and most importantly the why. Creating a design system at Booking then for me necessitated that not only I create the visual elements in the corresponding code, but also pages and pages of accompanying documentation. But before anything effective can be designed, I needed to define kind of like a common language, right? Something that ties the design system together at the fundamental level. Naming, syntax, all the things that kind of go into standardizing a common source of knowledge. All of it, like all the small details, they need to be defined. A lot of people, some designers, certainly a lot of non-designers, make the mistake of thinking that all those little details exist separate of this larger idea of design. But nothing's further from the truth. One of the things that guides me in not only this stage of creating a design system, but just kind of in all of my design work, this idea kind of talked about by Charles Eames, where he says, details are essentially, they're not refinements to a design. They're not tacked on at the end. In any design, clarity of thought and purpose, those things, are baked in. The details are abundant and they're baked in. They make the design. So one of the first details I had to kind of sort out at Booking was one of scope. So the company, as I mentioned earlier, handles two sets of customers: the guests, so travelers, and partners, hotels or people who are putting their apartments up for rent, all that kind of stuff. So for the sake of simplicity and scalability, I decided to approach it with a singular design system in mind. Just one thing handling both sets of customers and also handling all types of email, from your traditional marketing messages to transactional messages. The next kind of iteration of this idea of building these details is one of the most time-intensive and complicated of this process. It's naming things. We joke in our team that naming shit takes much longer than the creation of the system itself. But naming shit is essential to making a design system and just a design understandable, not only in your design organization, but throughout an organization as a whole. That understandability allows success down the line. And in a large organization, especially one as fragmented as Booking, establishing kind of a common tongue, a common language is key to a design system's success. So, we sit and we talk about these things. Like, what do we call things in the design system? This is part of that whole endless semantic conversation bit. How do you refer to elements within a design system? What sort of syntax and naming conventions scale the most easily? You can model your design system on something like Brad Frost does, which is kind of deeply scientifically rooted and has origins of biology. And that kind of depth allows for a lot of granularity and a lot of modularity in how you name things and what you can call things and how you scale things in different ways. But for me, I feel like this is kind of a needlessly complicated naming convention. What we found at Booking was that naming things kind of in this way and with this biological context means that you're fighting a lot of people's assumptions that are baked in from their time at school. Everybody kind of has an idea of what an organism is or what a compound is and what molecules are. And that leads to a lot more of these semantic infighting arguments. So at Booking, I pushed really hard for a more abstract and simplistic naming convention or categorization convention. Not that much more simple. It's just 4 levels versus Bradfast's 5. But our scale dictates the need for this simplicity. It's, like I said, a bit more shallow, but it also supports kind of like the massive amount of A/B testing Booking does by avoiding strict definitions around things like, well, what is a page and what's a template? Because so much A/B testing is done on pages and with these sections that I suppose you could call a template, the definitions kind of get a little blurrier. We've also covered kind of in rough terms what comprises each level, right? This is another super semantic conversation that like you can have for hours and hours and hours and never get an answer out of it. Ultimately for us, this idea of like, well, how many components equals a pattern? It's super blurry, like we don't define it. Because, that ambiguity is kind of baked into what a design system is. This is a pretty clear example, right? So a button, pretty clearly a component. A combination of a table and a price breakdown and a button is very clearly a pattern. But what about this? Right? Like a property display, is that a component? Is that a pattern? Like, is it too small to be a pattern? Is it too complex to just be a component? And then what about a footer? Right? Like, we kept having these discussions where, the idea is that a component maybe is something you display and it can be displayed without a specific context and it should just be understandable on its own. But that is also kind of like what a footer is, and that's much more complex than just a component. And so in the end, kind of what we've come to and what I kind of pushed in our organization is that determining what goes where is kind of like determining what is or isn't porn. You just kind of know it when you see it. Thankfully, like all this sort of ambiguity, you can very much clear up with documentation, which is why documentation is so important. Defining what it covers is one of the most important things you can do in establishing a design system. So with the system, given the inherent ambiguity and flexibility of these patterns and these components, documentation has to be very thorough and explicit. There's documentation that covers kind of what each element includes, just a general overview, and that covers the what. There's also an explanation on the why. Why is this designed the way it is? And then instructions for use, the how. There's also, sometimes when necessary, instructions on how to not use it and what not to do. And the language that you use in documentation matters as well. So I have a teammate, he and I go back and forth on this a lot. He says things like, well, you should use it this way. And if you look at his documentation versus mine says a lot like, you must use it this way. You should never use it this way. You can't use it this way. That kind of thing matters a lot. And then we also include kind of some editorial guidelines like voice and tone and image use. Typography rules are also in there. And then variants of an element. So in the end, like I said, a design system is a common language. It's shared by an organization and its customers. If you can understand how to put pages, how to put designs together very clearly in your organization, your customers will understand them very clearly when you put them, when they, are put in front of them. So now we got kind of like the common language part. And it helps, design synchronize into a coherent product, which is easier for everybody to understand. The next step is kind of creating it. So having this understandability definitely helps at this point. And my approach here is driven by this quote from Jared Spool. Design is the rendering of intent. It's kind of like a big deal quote at this point. Whether or not you always agree with Jared Spool is neither here nor there. He can be a controversial guy sometimes. But I think this is a really smart way to look at design. Many of Booking's emails lacked and still lack clear intent. They're just kind of like a jumble of information and disparate design. And one of the first things I did to counter that was establish this very specific set of boundaries, right, or rules. And it's in the foundations of the design system where that kind of thing starts. So these foundations, the grid, spacing, typography, iconography, they're all present in web and apps and email. But for email, I took the tack of diverging where necessary, because emails are not websites, they're also not mobile apps, so there are very specific sets of rules and standards to follow. Standards, that's ironic, but yeah. So the medium has considerations which you have to take into account. I'd also kind of used a lot of what I had learned in my 8 years at MailChimp in doing this kind of communitized, I don't even think that's a word, but this communitized sort of design that could be understood by a specific user base. Instead of doing it for a general audience like MailChimp's customers, I was now doing it for designers within the organization. Those differences between email and web and like these kind of specific rules are represented, I think, kind of well in how we treat the grid. So this is the email grid at Booking. It's pretty standard, 640 pixels wide. And it's composed of 8 columns of 64 pixels and separated by 16 pixel gutters. My choice of this grid was very intentional for some specific reasons. First and foremost, it doesn't allow an equally sized 3-column layout. That ruffled every designer's feathers for some reason. And they would all come to me and say, well, what if I need to do a 3-column layout? And I would counter with, what do you ever need a 3-column layout for? Simplify your design. The simpler it is, the easier it is for the customer to understand, the easier it is for your developer to build, the easier it is for the team as a whole to maintain over time, especially since Booking is moving to a hybrid system for all of its code. The same sort of specificity happens in our type ramp. So in web and apps, the type ramp has 8 type treatments ranging from small 12-pixel captions all the way up to 32-pixel main heading. I wanted the email type ramp to be much more simple, and I limited it to 5 elements. Really, there's no need for a 32-pixel heading in an email. Real estate is already short, and it does away with kind of one thing where if this email is viewed on mobile, then you have to throw a bunch of media queries at it to change the typeface. That works in a lot of clients at this point, but not some. And you know what, if we cut it out, we get rid of a lot of design and development overhead. The other sizes too were kind of brought up to meet email standards, right? So the body copy is 16 pixels in an email versus 14 on web and apps. So with components, you can kind of bring the same level of specificity, at least in defining the boundaries. But there has to be a little bit of a change in that the boundaries have to be set such that they inherently accept a high level of flexibility. So at Booking, the emails, like I said, are used across tons of different teams, across multiple business units, and the components and patterns have to accommodate all of that in a very simple way. So to that end, they're designed in a very flexible and adaptable way. So they're flexible in that, the components, like the statistics and the weather component, are the exact same thing. The only difference is in how the icon is displayed. And lower, the patterns down there are adaptable, right? They can be used for Booking.com, rentalcars.com, any other business units that might start to spring up. It's the same exact thing. It's built in the same way. It is, handled in the same way when you drop it in an email. The code's the same. The only difference is the content. Additionally, I don't worry about the exact size of any element. That's because of language and currency. So Booking's emails are translated into 43 languages. Booking handles 50 different currencies. And especially with the languages, there's very kind of little control over what the translations say at the end, or how short they are, how long they might be, what words are used. There's a system to provide some feedback to the copywriters and say, try to keep this as short as possible, but you see that there's a big difference between languages, right? Translating something from English, especially to Spanish or Portuguese, always lengthens it. Especially, Bulgarian, Russian, long words. And so this idea that all designers kind of love is, and I've had designers at the organization kind of come at me with this and ask, like, well, what if I want all of these to be 400 pixels tall? Like, well, don't. Stop caring about that. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the content is displayed in a clear, understandable fashion. What is important in designing like this is that spacing and hierarchy rule the day, not exact sizing. You create understandability with very clear spacing and this hierarchy of we contain some elements in a box, other times we don't. And that clarity is infinitely more important than making sure all of these are 400 pixels tall. So all of this goes towards making a design system a single source of truth in the organization. And because there are kind of very specific rules around how things can and should be used, it increases speed of production while reducing complexity at the same time. And the purpose of a design system, of every design system, is to ensure that designers are designing less and developers are writing less code. It's not, a design system is not a method that exists for doing more design. It's a method that exists for increasing the efficiency of design in an organization. And it also helps get designers thinking in the same way, which is really useful in the next phase, which is the maintenance of a design system. Maintaining a design system is a full-time gig. Stagnation kind of happens naturally as part of a design system because there's a natural evolution that will happen as new patterns get added, but then new designers come into the organization and they use maybe a little bit less of the design system and go off and do their own things. That's natural. But that kind of natural breakdown accelerates without constant care. It's a stagnation that I watched happen at MailChimp over the years. And so one of the things that's really important to the success of a design system is figuring out how to get people involved in caring for it. It's a garden. My approach here is kind of rooted in this quote, in that my design system is very, very opinionated. The designs, the way it's coded, the approaches are rooted in my experience and my intuition, no matter how imperfect some of my assumptions might be. Because the next step of that is to kind of prove myself wrong by engaging in creative doubt. Whether that's me sitting there and building comp after comp of different emails for different kind of situations and teams, or if it's getting other designers to sit there and look and come to me and say, well, this kind of pattern doesn't work in this situation, we have to refine or we have to make something else. This kind of collaboration and feedback is paramount to the success of any design system. So one way we kind of get people involved is by distribution. Right? People can't know what they're working with unless they can get to it. So one of the ways we do that is this internal site, Design at Booking. It's a source of truth for all design at booking.com. It works a lot like Atlassian's site. IBM has a great design system, so does Salesforce. I guess Lightning is kind of like the classical example at this point. So this site contains everything I've talked about. It covers documentation at a very deep level. It has, design and development assets in the component viewer, all these things. It also includes kind of higher level information like brand guidelines, accessibility practices, voice and tone, all of these things. The next thing is the big tool. So this is an internal tool. We're kind of working on getting it open source so teams across the world can start using it in their organizations. It's essentially an inspection tool for the booking design system. So this tool, desktop app, the idea is that designers leave it open while they're working, and they can, drag. So here, these buttons, excuse me, they can drag these buttons from this application straight into Sketch. And so there's no fiddling around with, okay, well, I have to copy this from the site visually, and then you eventually over time start to get, little inconsistencies. Oh, well, maybe somebody didn't, leave enough spacing at the bottom of this button between the word as they normally should have. So it helps kind of maintain the integrity of the design system. It also speeds up this idea of iteration and helps you find more quickly areas in which the design system doesn't work or doesn't properly support, right? Because it allows people to put designs together super quickly. And this approach is kind of helpful and necessary for the evolution of the design system. So initially, in one of the emails a designer was working on, the instruction was, well, use a table component, right? Just that top component there to display some information. But that didn't really meet the needs of the designer working on the email for the business unit that they're in. So they kind of created their own iteration. That's the second one there, because they needed the information to be a little bit more visible in the email and draw more attention. And that kind of kicked off this iterative process where those final, it went from the second one to the third one after a little bit of refinement, and then some more refinement. We ended up with that final version there, and that's what's in the design system. And that is a direct result of somebody not only collaborating but contributing to the design system on their own. And having, a way to distribute means that people have an easy way to consume. They also have an easy way to come in, collaborate, and then give back to the system. So all the visual elements live in these kind of massive sketch libraries. These are fairly simple to set up for any designer. Massive, massive files that live on GitLab, and so by putting them up in a GitLab repository, not only do we have version control, we have an easy way for designers to grab and pull and use them as they wish if they don't want to go through that tool. And all of these methods allow this evolution of the design system. And so it makes it also this living repository of knowledge that evolves with the needs of the business. And my job now is to kind of shepherd that going forward in a methodical and intelligent way. All that being said, I can boil this whole talk down into one grand lesson, and it is this: that you can't fix an enterprise email system or any email system with just design. It will never work. I can help bookings emails go from something like that on the left, to something like that on the right. But it won't fix the fundamental problems of this email. This is an abandoned cart email. Kind of a super easy thing. But you could book this hotel, and because there's a mismatch in strategy and systems in the background, you could still get an abandoned cart email for a hotel we know you've booked. Design doesn't fix that. The thing that design can do to help with that is it does create breathing room, right? If you have everybody able to quickly iterate on designs and put them together much more quickly, it then leaves them more time to think about the super important stuff like strategy and planning and building a healthy email marketing program. At the end of the day, though, I can't tell you whether or not these steps will be successful. Like I said, this is a journey I'm still on. Booking is a big company. It's a big ship to steer. But I hope that in some way, telling this story has given everybody kind of an idea of how to approach a similar set of problems at their organizations. And who knows, maybe I'll be back next year and I'll talk about how I was successful. Thank you.